The gold under Burkina Faso's soil has always glowed, but for decades that glow lit up bank accounts in Toronto, Montreal, and London far more than it lit the homes of the people who lived above it. Planes carried gold away in the dead of night, but somehow the schools stayed unfunded, the clinics under-equipped, and the roads unfinished. It was the same story told across Africa for over a century. The wealth was here, but the power to control it was not. Then came a silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence before a decisive move. There were no massive protests, no breaking news alerts, just a quiet rewriting of the rules, one signature at a time, one policy at a time. In August 2024, a revised mining code tilted the balance of power toward the state. Months later, 5 of the largest gold mines in the country, all active, all profitable, all foreign-run, were suddenly in the hands of a brand-new state-owned company. No buyouts, no compromise, no way back. It wasn't just an economic decision, it was a statement: the gold beneath our feet will serve us first. And when Canada's mining giants packed their offices and walked away, the message spread far beyond West Africa. The old rules were crumbling. But here's the question that lingers: is this bold takeover the dawn of a new African economic independence, or the start of a dangerous gamble against the most powerful mining lobbies in the world? If you've ever believed that the people living above the resources should be the first to benefit from them, this is a story you need to hear. Stay with me, because what happened in Burkina Faso is not just a mining story. It's a lesson in sovereignty, resilience, and the courage to finally say enough. It started long before the headlines caught up. In early 2024, whispers began circulating in Ouagadougou's business circles, whispers that the government was quietly tightening its grip on the mining sector. The signs were subtle but deliberate. Foreign companies faced new bureaucratic hurdles, permits took longer to process, environmental audits suddenly appeared on the schedule, and taxation discussions became more pointed. To the casual observer, it looked like routine government oversight. But to those paying close attention, it was clear the ground was shifting under the feet of some of the world's largest gold producers. For decades, Canadian mining giants like Endeavour Mining Samafo and Fortuna Silver Mines had dominated Burkina Faso's gold industry. They weren't just operators, they were power brokers. Boards met in Toronto, investment strategies were crafted in Montreal, and decisions affecting thousands of Burkinabé workers were made thousands of miles away. The wealth extracted from West Africa's fourth largest gold producer, over 57 tons in 2023 alone, mostly boarded flights to North America and Europe. The nation itself remained among the poorest in the world, a paradox that had become so normalized it barely drew outrage anymore. That complacency ended in August 2024. The transitional government under President Ibrahim Traoré passed a revised national mining code. On paper, it was a legislative update. In reality, it was a strategic weapon. The law mandated that the state hold at least a 10% stake in all new mining operations. More importantly, it gave the government the right to raise that stake to as much as 70% in strategic cases. And in Burkina Faso, gold is as strategic as it gets. Foreign executives were stunned. A few months earlier, they had been negotiating expansions and license renewals. Now they were staring at a legal framework that could strip them of majority control at any moment. Behind closed doors, conversations turned from growth strategies to exit plans. By late 2024, the turning point had arrived. 5 major gold mining operations, each producing hundreds of thousands of ounces annually, were formally transferred to a newly created state-owned company, SOAPAIB, short for Société de Patrimoine Minier du Burkina Faso. These weren't abandoned pits or projects in early development. They were fully operational mines, some of them run for over a decade under Canadian management. In a single-stroke, control over vast streams of wealth shifted from corporate boardrooms overseas to the government offices in Ouagadougou. The takeover wasn't negotiated with generous buyouts or gradual phase-outs. It was a clean break. Canadian companies received no compensation. They could have fought back in international arbitration courts, but they didn't. The risks were too high. A legal battle could have dragged their African operations into the spotlight, reigniting controversies about environmental damage, labor practices, and profit-sharing inequities. Losing in court would have been a public relations disaster. Even winning might have cost them licenses in other African nations. In the end, they chose to walk away quietly. And so without gunfire, without protests, without the chaos of national strikes, the industry landscape transformed. Burkina Faso had pulled off what many thought impossible, reclaiming control over its most valuable resource without sparking an economic collapse. From the very beginning, Traore and his administration had made their intention clear. Foreign investment would still have a place, but only under new rules where the state held the steering wheel. The gold beneath Burkina Faso's soil would no longer be just another line item on a foreign company's balance sheet. It would be the backbone of national development. This was more than a change of ownership. It was a rejection of a century-old economic model, one where African nations provided raw resources, foreign corporations extracted the profits, and the local population received only the leftovers. By taking back control, Burkina Faso was signaling to the world, and especially to its neighbors in the Sahel, that sovereignty is not granted, it is taken. The announcement didn't come with fireworks or a grand ceremony. It came in the form of a short, matter-of-fact government statement. 5 gold mines, all previously foreign operated, would now be run entirely by SOAPAIB. In the world of global mining, those few lines landed like a thunderclap. For the Canadian companies involved, it was the end of an era. Executives in Toronto and Vancouver scrambled to draft public statements, choosing their words carefully. They didn't say we've been pushed out. Instead, they spoke of changing conditions, security concerns, and a shift in investment priorities. Fortuna Silver Mines, one of the larger players in the game, announced in May 2025 that it was redirecting its investments to Guinea. They never named Burkina Faso. They didn't have to. Everyone in the industry knew why they were leaving. Behind closed doors, the truth was blunt. There was no deal to salvage. Burkina Faso wasn't offering buyouts, transitional partnerships, or middle ground solutions. The government had made its position clear: the gold sector would serve Burkina Faso first, and any foreign involvement would happen strictly on those terms. If that didn't work for the multinationals, they were free to leave. And they did. The reaction on the markets was immediate. Investors, realizing that the Burkina model might inspire copycats across Africa, dumped shares of mining companies with heavy exposure to the continent. Billions in market capitalization vanished in weeks. Analysts in London and New York began writing nervous reports, warning that resource nationalism was no longer an isolated risk but a coordinated trend. Canada's government, often quick to defend its corporate interests abroad, stayed notably quiet. There were no strong diplomatic protests, no threats of sanctions. That silence spoke volumes. Ottawa had spent years fending off criticism about the conduct of its mining companies in Africa, from environmental damage to exploitative labor practices. A high-profile fight with Burkina Faso would have dragged those issues back into the spotlight and risked political embarrassment at home. Better to let the companies frame their exit as a business decision than to expose Canada's image to further scrutiny. Inside Burkina Faso, the mood was electric. For years, the idea of a state-led mining sector had been dismissed as unrealistic, the kind of nationalist rhetoric that sounds good in speeches but falls apart in reality. Yet, here it was happening in real time. Workers who had worn Canadian company uniforms one month were now showing up in SOAPAIB-branded gear the next. Geologists, engineers, and plant operators who once reported to bosses thousands of miles away were now sending their data and decisions to offices in Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré kept his words measured but unmistakable. The wealth beneath our feet is no longer for export to enrich others while our people remain poor. It is for the people of Burkina Faso. For the country's neighbors, this was more than an inspiring soundbite, it was a strategic playbook. Mali, with its own vast gold reserves, and Niger, with uranium deposits vital to Europe's nuclear industry, had already been discussing ways to assert more control over their resources. The three nations, all former French colonies, were now openly coordinating their approaches, forming a bloc that could resist the economic pressure tactics long used by foreign powers to keep African nations compliant. In this moment, the Burkina model was no longer just a domestic reform, it was a regional rallying point. African leaders saw that you could confront the most powerful multinationals in the mining sector, survive the blowback, and even come out stronger. But if the reaction across Africa was one of admiration, the tone in Western capitals was different. Policy circles in Washington, Paris, and Brussels began talking about supply chain security and strategic resource vulnerabilities. It wasn't lost on them that this shift in resource control could complicate everything from electronics manufacturing to energy production. If gold from Burkina Faso, uranium from Niger, and lithium from other African nations were now moving under African government terms, the cost and availability of these critical materials could change overnight. What made the situation even more alarming for foreign powers was how cleanly it had been executed. There had been no civil unrest, no production collapse, no major disruption to output, all the things usually predicted when a state takes over an industry. Instead, SOAPAIB kept operations running smoothly, proving wrong the long-standing claim that African governments lack the technical expertise to manage large-scale mining. This was the true high point of the story, not just the takeover itself, but the fact that it worked. The gold kept flowing, but for the first time in living memory, it was flowing into the coffers of the Burkinabé state, funding hospitals, schools, infrastructure projects, and rural development programs. It was here, in this quiet but decisive shift, that the world began to understand Burkina Faso wasn't playing for symbolism. It was playing for keeps. The real measure of Burkina Faso's mining revolution was never going to be written on a stock exchange ticker in Toronto or London. It would be written in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the villages of the Sahel, and in the faces of the people who had always lived above the gold but never felt its touch. By the first quarter of 2025, the numbers spoke louder than any speech. 11 tons of gold worth roughly $780 million at current market prices had been collected by state-controlled initiatives in just 3 months. This wasn't theoretical revenue. This was money already flowing into national projects. In rural provinces, new classrooms were opening, stocked with desks and textbooks bought with mining profits that just a year earlier would have been wired to foreign shareholders. In urban clinics, shipments of medicine arrived without the usual donor conditions or foreign aid branding. The source of funding was proudly Burkinabé. The integration of small-scale miners into the national strategy was another civil victory. For decades, artisanal miners had been treated as trespassers on their own land, chased away by security forces working for multinational companies accused of illegal mining, and often left without alternatives. Traoré's government changed that. Instead of criminalizing them, it formalized their work, provided training, and created cooperative systems where small-scale miners could sell their gold directly to the state at fair prices. This policy did more than bring extra gold into official records. It restored dignity to tens of thousands of families. Politically, the impact was seismic. In a country long accustomed to foreign dominance in its key industries, the sight of a Burkinabé-owned company controlling the gold sector sent a message far beyond economics. This government was willing to confront powerful external interests head-on and win. Ibrahim Traoré's approval ratings, already buoyed by his anti-corruption stance and security reforms, soared even higher. He became not just a transitional leader, but a symbol of defiance and capability across Africa. This shift also altered the country's negotiating power on the international stage. Burkina Faso was no longer approaching foreign investors as a dependent partner desperate for capital. It was now a resource owner with leverage. Offers for joint ventures began to arrive from unexpected places, including from African and Asian partners willing to accept terms that respected state control. This, in turn, created a new political reality. Burkina Faso could choose its economic allies rather than being forced into the arms of the highest bidder from the West. Of course, there were risks. Managing a multi-billion-dollar industry is no small task, and critics warned of the dangers mismanagement, corruption, and inefficiency could erode the gains. The government countered by emphasizing transparency measures within SOAPAIB, publishing production figures, and involving local businesses in logistics, maintenance, and security contracts. By funneling mining-related work to domestic companies, the state not only reduced dependency on foreign contractors, but also expanded the economic ripple effect of the sector. On the regional front, the political implications were just as significant. Burkina Faso's bold move added momentum to the resource sovereignty agenda being pushed by the AES alliance with Mali and Niger. Together, these nations control gold, uranium, and other critical minerals that power global industries. By showing that nationalization could be done without economic collapse, Burkina Faso gave its allies a blueprint and its adversaries a warning. Domestically, the sense of ownership and pride was palpable. In towns near the reclaimed mines, residents spoke of a new era where the country's wealth would no longer pass them by. SOAPAIB's recruitment of former employees from Canadian-run operations meant that technical expertise remained intact, while decision-making was now localized. This combination, global-level skill with national-level accountability, became a point of pride in political speeches and media coverage. Even the opposition, while critical of certain aspects of implementation, found it difficult to attack the core policy without alienating voters who supported the idea of reclaiming national resources. The political debate shifted from whether nationalization was right to how it could be best managed, a sign that the concept had gained irreversible legitimacy. Perhaps most telling was the change in public discourse. For decades, conversations about gold in Burkina Faso revolved around exports, foreign investment, and fluctuating world prices. Now, people were talking about refinery construction, domestic processing capacity, and how gold revenues should be allocated to healthcare, education, and infrastructure. In other words, the conversation had shifted from extraction to development, from what left the country to what stayed. The political message was clear: Burkina Faso was no longer content to be a supplier in someone else's empire. It was building the foundations of its own. In Washington, the news from Burkina Faso didn't just register as an African domestic matter, it triggered deeper strategic concerns. The United States, long accustomed to securing access to critical resources through corporate partnerships, now faced a precedent that could ripple across the continent. If more nations adopted the Burkina model, American manufacturers could find themselves negotiating directly with African governments that hold most of the cards. For decades, U.S. policy toward Africa's resource sector has been built on stability agreements, predictable tax regimes, and foreign direct investment through multinational corporations. Burkina Faso's move tore a page out of that playbook and replaced it with something far less predictable: state ownership with a regional alliance to back it up. For U.S. tech firms, defense contractors, and energy companies, all reliant on a steady flow of gold and other minerals, this shift meant potential supply chain disruptions and higher costs. In Ottawa, the reaction was quieter but no less significant. Canada's mining industry has been one of its most visible global exports, and West Africa has long been a centerpiece of its overseas portfolio. Watching Canadian firms walk away without compensation sent shockwaves through the investment community. If it could happen in Burkina Faso, what would stop Mali, Niger, or even larger economies from following suit? The unspoken fear was that the era of guaranteed access to African mines, secured through decades of legal frameworks favorable to foreign investors, might be ending. Europe, too, was paying attention. With Niger already asserting control over its uranium exports and Mali moving to protect its gold sector, Burkina Faso's takeover added momentum to a regional resource sovereignty movement that could challenge Europe's industrial planning. Brussels policymakers began using phrases like strategic vulnerability in closed-door sessions, aware that a coordinated Sahel resource policy could fundamentally alter global supply lines. But for much of the global south, the message from Ouagadougou was empowering. Leaders in Latin America and Asia saw echoes of their own struggles against resource exploitation. Editorials in newspapers from Buenos Aires to Jakarta framed Burkina Faso's action not as isolationism, but as a demand for fairer terms in global trade. In the court of global opinion, Burkina Faso had done more than reclaim its gold. It had forced powerful nations to acknowledge that African governments could rewrite the rules and enforce them. Burkina Faso's gold revolution is more than a national triumph, it's a line in the sand. For generations, the story of Africa's resources has been told by those who take them. Now, in one corner of the Sahel, the people living above the gold have claimed the right to tell their own story and to keep the wealth it brings. But history teaches us that such victories are never left uncontested. The powers that once controlled these mines and the systems that enabled them will adapt, regroup, and attempt to reassert influence. It may not come in the form of armies or coups, but through subtler pressures, trade restrictions, targeted sanctions, or shadow deals meant to fracture the unity of the AI's alliance. The question is not if such pressure will come, but when. And yet there is something different about this moment. Burkina Faso did not act alone. It moved in coordination with Mali and Niger, building a regional shield against isolation. It did not destroy production. It maintained and even expanded it, proving that sovereignty does not have to mean economic collapse. It did not rely on foreign managers. It empowered its own engineers, geologists, and miners. For the rest of Africa, the lesson is both inspiring and sobering. Taking back control of your resources is possible, but holding on to it requires discipline, transparency, and unity. The world is watching not just to see if Burkina Faso can succeed, but to see if this model can spread without breaking under pressure. For audiences beyond Africa, especially in places like the United States, this is a rare chance to witness the rewriting of a global economic relationship in real time. The gold leaving Burkina Faso today is no longer just a commodity. It's a statement, a challenge to an old order that assumed Africa's role was to supply, not decide. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's bold nationalization strategy can truly withstand the political and economic pushback that's coming? Or is this just the opening chapter of a much longer fight for control? Please share this video if you believe Africa's wealth should finally serve Africa's people. And subscribe if you know that the truth is always worth defending, even when it challenges the most powerful players in the game.